Tonight, we begin not with the towering figure of a president, but with the quiet birth of a child in the winter-chilled stillness of the Kentucky wilderness, a boy born on February 12, 1809, in a modest one-room log cabin nestled near the remote town of Hodgenville. This child, wrapped in the rawness of poverty, never saw a crib, a candlelit nursery, or a future paved in certainty. His name was Abraham Lincoln, and the story of how he rose from the dirt floor of a frontier shack to command the fractured heart of a nation is as unlikely as it is unforgettable. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a restless carpenter and farmer, a man shaped by sweat and sternness, moving his family often in search of land and stability, though stability never stayed long. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, was a soft contrast tender, deeply spiritual, and the source of the quiet introspection that would come to define her son. That peace never lingers long on the edge of civilization, and tragedy struck early when, at the fragile age of 9, Abraham watched his mother fall ill with milk sickness, a cruel, creeping disease caused by drinking milk from cows who had grazed on toxic plants. She died quickly, leaving behind a house heavy with sorrow and a boy wounded in silence. That grief, quiet and unresolved, became part of Lincoln's soul, a thread of melancholy that would follow him even to the White House. And yet, life has a way of offering light just when darkness threatens to take hold. Thomas remarried a kind widow named Sarah Bush Johnston, who brought with her not just warmth and furniture, but something far more valuable: books. She recognized, perhaps before anyone else, that there was something uncommon about young Abe, not just in the way he worked or spoke, but in the deep, almost holy hunger in his eyes when he held a book. And though his father believed in axes and fields, Sarah believed in pages and thought. With almost no formal schooling, barely a year in total, Lincoln devoured what few books he could find. The Bible, Aesop's Fables, Robinson Crusoe, and, later, Shakespeare. These weren't just stories. They were mentors. By candlelight and silence broken only by the howling wind or the creak of the cabin walls, the boy read and reread each line, sometimes walking miles to borrow a single volume. He had no tutor but time, no guide but his own thirst. While other boys wrestled or hunted, Lincoln often sat under a tree, his long legs folded beneath him, a book open in his lap, disappearing into imagined worlds far beyond the Indiana backwoods. He was awkward tall before his time, with clothes that never quite fit and hands too big for a boy his age. Neighbors found him strange. He spoke rarely, but when he did, his words seemed older than he was, marked by a gravity most children didn't possess. He could out-whistle the strongest boy in the county, yet quote poetry with an almost sacred reverence. In that strange contrast, physical might wrapped in poetic quiet, Lincoln began to form. His stepmother once said that he would read aloud entire passages, memorize them, repeat them again and again. Books were not escape for him, they were transformation. The cabin may have taught him to survive, but the books taught him to think, to reason, to dream of a life larger than the one handed to him by birth. As he aged into his late teens and 20s, the road ahead was still unclear, but his resolve only strengthened. By the time he turned 21, Lincoln towered at 6 feet 4 inches, a gangly figure who looked carved from the same trees he once split for firewood. He wore threadbare clothes, pants always a few inches short, sleeves hanging loose, and a hat worn down by years of sun and storm. His voice was calm and slow, with a frontier rhythm that made every word feel measured and every silence feel intentional. In 1831, Lincoln landed in the small town of New Salem, Illinois. Money, no connections, no profession. But he had something else, something you can't teach. People liked him. Quickly hired as a store clerk, Lincoln made an impression not For business acumen, but for integrity so pure it bordered on legendary. If a customer overpaid by a few cents, he would walk for miles just to return the change. If he borrowed a book or a tool, he returned it cleaner, better, sometimes wrapped. In gratitude. Soon they began calling him Honest Abe, a title he never asked for, but never lost. His wit also made him beloved. He told long, meandering stories with perfect timing and humor, turning even the dullest tale into an event worth gathering around. And though he was unpolished, even awkward, people listened. He had that rare gift, authenticity. He spoke like one of them, worked like one of them, but dreamed bigger than all of them. In 1832, he made his first attempt at public office, running for the state legislature. He lost, but instead of fading away, he tried again. In the meantime, he served in the Black Hawk War, not as a soldier of great combat, but as a captain elected by his peers, a role that again revealed how people, even strangers, trusted him instinctively. 2 years later, he ran again, and this time he won. In New Salem, the foundation of public life began to form, but Lincoln knew he needed more than just popularity to shape the future he wanted. So he turned to the law. With no university, no mentor, and no guide, he did what he had always done: read alone. He borrowed law books and pored over them late into the night, just as he had once done with fables and scripture. He studied tirelessly until, in 1836, he passed the bar and became a licensed attorney. He moved to Springfield, Illinois, a town alive with politics and ambition, and there he began his practice. He took every kind of case: property disputes, debt collections, assaults, even murder. His courtroom style was plain but persuasive. He spoke directly, used humor strategically, and never mocked his opponents. He argued not to dominate, but to illuminate. His peers respected him, his clients trusted him. He rarely shouted, but when he did, it mattered. And Springfield didn't just sharpen his career, it changed his life. There he met Mary Todd, a sharp-witted, well-educated woman from a wealthy Kentucky family. Mary was unlike anyone Lincoln had ever known. She was confident, politically savvy, and driven, qualities that matched his own hidden ambitions. Their courtship was turbulent. They became engaged, broke it off, and reconciled again. Some said Lincoln feared he wasn't good enough for her. Others believed he doubted he could give her the life she deserved. Still, on November 4th, 1842, they married. Their union was passionate, intellectual, and often stormy. Mary, prone to emotional swings, had a fiery nature, while Lincoln remained distant, contemplative, often battling spells of deep melancholy. Yet beneath the friction was mutual admiration and purpose. Mary believed in his potential politically, morally, historically, and she pushed him forward when he might have hesitated. As their home filled with children and his law practice grew, so too did a sense of destiny. He was no longer just a frontier lawyer or a curious storyteller from the woods. He was a man being shaped by loss, by love, by learning for something greater. Lincoln, once the boy who read by firelight while wolves howled in the distance, was beginning to stand taller, not just in height, but in resolve. In courtrooms, in conversations, and slowly, in the halls of government, his voice steady, clear, and uniquely his began to rise above the noise of ambition. He wasn't just telling stories anymore. He was beginning to write one of his own. A story not just of survival, but of moral clarity, of relentless pursuit, and of the belief that words, spoken softly, can still move the hearts of a nation. They loved each other deeply, but their life together was not without sorrow. Abraham and Mary Todd Lincoln had 4 sons: Robert, Edward, William, known as Willie, and Thomas, nicknamed Tad. But heartbreak would strike again and again. Edward died at the tender age of 4. Willie, perhaps the child dearest to Lincoln's heart, passed away from illness inside the White House at just 11 years old, while the Civil War thundered outside. Only Robert would survive into adulthood. Behind the courtroom triumphs, behind the rise of a quiet man into the public spotlight, Lincoln carried this private grief like a second skin. Friends and aides spoke of his long silences, his tendency to walk alone for hours, his eyes clouded by something no election or title could cure. His melancholy seemed almost part of him, a shadow that never quite left his side, yet through that sorrow he endured. For Lincoln, law and politics were never just professions. They were pathways to something larger, something rooted in fairness and justice. He had come to believe more and more that the promise of America was unfinished, that liberty was too often claimed and too rarely shared. By the mid-1850s, the country was unraveling under the weight of its contradictions. It called itself the land of freedom, and yet millions of human beings were enslaved. The debate over slavery had transformed from a policy issue into a moral and existential crisis. And Abraham Lincoln, who had once served a quiet single term in Congress and faded back into private life, felt the pull of public service again. At first, he was cautious. He hated slavery, calling it a moral wrong, but he did not see himself as a radical. What he did believe deeply, stubbornly, was that slavery must not be allowed to expand. And it was this belief that returned him to the political stage. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, opening new territories to decide for themselves whether slavery would be allowed. To Lincoln, this was not just bad legislation, it was a betrayal of the founding promise. So he began to speak again. Slowly at first, in quiet town halls and dusty courthouses. But his words gathered power. And then came 1858, the year of the legendary Lincoln-Douglas debates. Stephen A. Douglas was a commanding figure, a sitting senator, confident, clever, and well-known. Lincoln, by contrast, looked plain tall, awkward, his clothes wrinkled and worn. But when the two men faced off across Illinois in 7 open-air debates, it was Lincoln who left the deepest impression. He didn't speak in fury. He spoke with calm reasoning, with careful moral logic, with clarity. "A house divided against itself cannot stand," he said. "I believe this government cannot endure, permanently half slave and half free." Though Lincoln lost the Senate race, the debates gave him something more powerful than office. They gave him a voice across the nation. His speeches were printed in newspapers from coast to coast. People who had never seen him now quoted him. They began to wonder, could this man be something more than a prairie lawyer? By 1860, the Republican Party saw in Lincoln something rare, a man who opposed slavery not with venom, but with principle, a man who spoke firmly, yet without cruelty. He wasn't the favorite, but in a divided political landscape, he emerged as the nominee. And on a cold night in November of that year, Abraham Lincoln, born in a log cabin, raised in poverty, shaped by loss and self-education, was elected the 16th President of the United States. But there was no time for celebration. Even before he took the oath of office, Southern states began to secede. They saw Lincoln's election as a threat to their way of life, especially the institution of slavery. The country was coming apart at the seams. And by the time Lincoln placed his hand on the Bible in March 1861, 7 states had already left the Union. War would follow. Lincoln did not seek war. He wanted peace, unity, compromise. But when Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter in April, the choice was no longer his to make. The Civil War had begun. Lincoln had no military background. He had never commanded troops. Yet now he was commander-in-chief of a fractured nation. He spent nights reading military texts, days meeting with generals, and countless hours wrestling with decisions that had no good answers. The war was long, brutal, and intimate. It wasn't fought on distant shores, but in hometowns and fields. Families were torn apart, cities were destroyed, brothers fought brothers. And through it all, Lincoln faced not just a rebellion, but doubt from every side. Newspapers mocked his appearance. Political opponents called him a dictator. His own cabinet often doubted him. He replaced one general after another, looking for a leader who could bring a swift end to the bloodshed. And still, the war dragged on. Then, in the middle of it all, personal tragedy struck again. In February 1862, young Willie Lincoln died. From typhoid fever in the White House, Lincoln was crushed. He stopped attending cabinet meetings. He wandered the halls alone. He visited his son's grave at night. The sadness that had followed him all his life now consumed him. But even in this grief, he kept going, because he believed this war, terrible as it was, had become about something more than just preserving the Union. In January 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It declared enslaved people in Confederate states to be free. It did not free every slave in America, but it transformed the war into a moral crusade. It told the world and history that this nation was not fighting only for geography, but for justice. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong, Lincoln had once said. With the stroke of a pen, he made that belief national policy. And though the war raged on, a line had been drawn. Then came Gettysburg. The battle was one of the bloodiest of the war, leaving over 50,000 men dead, wounded, or missing. In November 1863, Lincoln traveled to dedicate the battlefield as a national cemetery. The main speaker delivered a 2-hour address. Lincoln spoke for less than 2 minutes, just 272 words. And yet, in those few lines, he redefined the purpose of the war and the nation itself. 77 years ago, he began reminding listeners of the birth of the Republic. He ended with a promise that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. That speech, barely heard at the time, would echo through centuries. And as the war neared its end in 1865, Lincoln showed no desire for revenge. He wanted healing. In his second inaugural address, he did not boast. He urged mercy. With malice toward none, with charity for all, he said, calling on Americans to bind up wounds, to care for the living and the widowed and the orphaned. And then finally, on April 9th, 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. The war was over. The Union had been saved. Slavery was dying. But Lincoln, worn thin by war, never let pride overtake his purpose. His face was deeply lined, his once dark beard now gray. He had aged decades in just a few years. And yet, in those final days, he began to speak of the future, of reconciliation, of rebuilding. He dreamed a lot of peace. He had done what no one else had. He held the country together through fire. But fate had one more turn. Bells rang and crowds cheered. There was a sense of relief, of cautious hope. People imagined a future of rebuilding, of reunion. Lincoln began making plans not just to restore the South, but to reimagine what America could become. He would never get the chance. Just 5 days after Lee's surrender, on the evening of April 14th, 1865, Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. As he sat in his theater box, a well-known actor and Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth slipped in and shot him in the back of the head. Lincoln never regained consciousness. He died the next morning, April 15th, with his wife, Mary, by his side, and the nation in mourning. He had lived to see the war end, but not the peace that followed. When Abraham Lincoln died, the country didn't just lose a president, it lost its compass. News of his death spread like a cold wind across the nation. In the North, people wept openly in the streets. Church bells rang for hours. Businesses closed. Entire cities went silent. Even those who had once criticized him now spoke of his greatness with reverence. His body was placed in a grand funeral train that journeyed from Washington, D.C., all the way back to his home in Springfield, Illinois. Along the route, thousands lined the tracks, standing in silence as the train passed. Men removed their hats. Women held their children close. It wasn't just mourning. It was a farewell to the man who had held them together during the country's darkest hour. Lincoln was buried in Oak Ridge Cemetery near the town where he had once walked as a young lawyer. The grave would soon be marked by a towering monument, and later, still his face would be etched in stone at Mount Rushmore and printed on currency. But behind all the marble and myths was a man, a real man, one who battled depression, who knew grief intimately, who never believed himself to be extraordinary. And yet he changed everything. Lincoln didn't live to see the full impact of his work. He never saw the Reconstruction struggles or the long civil rights movement that would come. More than a century later, but the seeds he planted in speeches and laws and moral clarity continued to grow. He reminded America what it should strive to be, not perfect, but better, not divided, but united, not driven by hate or fear, but by compassion, reason, and courage. Today, we remember Lincoln as the great emancipator, the savior of the Union, the man who led with both strength and gentleness. But perhaps what makes him truly great is not just what he did, it's who he was, a boy who read by candlelight. A lawyer who spoke with honesty, a leader who never lost sight of humanity. His life reminds us that greatness doesn't require perfection, only purpose, integrity, and a heart that refuses to turn away from what is right. In that way, Abraham Lincoln still lives in the ideals he helped shape and in the quiet strength he left behind to many. The word Viking conjures images of wild warriors with axes and horned helmets, storming villages and burning everything in sight. But the truth, as it often is with history, is more complicated and far more interesting. The Vikings weren't a single people or empire. They were Norsemen, seafaring tribes from modern-day Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, living between the late 8th and early 11th centuries. To themselves, they weren't even Vikings. The term Viking was more a verb than a name. To go Viking meant to go on an expedition, sometimes to trade, sometimes to raid. They were farmers, fishermen, blacksmiths, storytellers. They raised goats and wheat. They built wooden halls. They worshipped gods like Odin and Thor and believed that their fate was woven by unseen hands, the Norns who watched over every soul. Most Viking men were warriors. They were workers, strong, skilled, and deeply connected to the land. But when the harvest failed, when the fjords froze, when opportunity called across the sea, many took up their shields and swords. They weren't driven by bloodlust. They were driven by survival and ambition. Their world was one of harsh winters, short summers, and a constant struggle against nature. But they were adaptable, fiercely so, and their curiosity was endless. They sailed across waters others feared. They explored unknown lands. They mingled with cultures far beyond their own. Some became merchants, sailing down the rivers of Eastern Europe to trade in silk and spices with the Byzantines. Others founded settlements in places as far as Ireland, France, and even Russia. To those they attacked, they were seen as barbarians, destroyers of peace. But to themselves, they were bold adventurers, carving out a future in a world that often gave them little. It's easy to paint them with one brush, to imagine them as only raiders. But their true story is more layered, more human. Before we follow them across seas into battles and legends, we must first remember the Vikings were not monsters. They were men, and they were about to change the world. If the Vikings had one unmatched advantage, it was their ships. Long, narrow, and elegant in design, the Viking longship was not just a mode of transport. It was a symbol of freedom, fear, and possibility. Carved from oak and assembled with precision, these vessels were both strong and flexible. The wood planks overlapped like fish scales, held together with iron rivets and sealed with animal hair and tar to keep out the cold, salty sea. Their design allowed the hulls to flex with the waves instead of fighting them, giving the longships incredible stability in rough water. Each one was a marvel of engineering. The average longship could carry 40 to 60 warriors along with supplies, tools, and weapons. But what made them so feared and so effective wasn't just their size or speed, it was their adaptability. Viking ships could travel across the open ocean and then glide silently up narrow rivers. They could sail in just a meter of water, meaning they could strike deep inland where no one expected them, and they didn't need harbors or docks to land, just a stretch of beach, a shallow bank, or even a rocky shore. In the time it took villagers to spot them, the Vikings were already a sure dot at the front of many ships was a carved figurehead, often a dragon or serpent, designed to frighten both enemies and evil spirits. As the ships approached, the sea seemed to churn beneath their prows, their sails full of wind, their crews silent but ready. The sight of a longship on the horizon became the stuff of nightmares across Europe. It meant trouble was coming fast, unexpected, and ruthless, but not all. Longships were used for war. Some were merchant vessels, wider and deeper to carry goods. Others were for exploration, sailing west to Iceland, Greenland, and beyond. The longship was more than a machine. It was freedom, a way to escape poverty, seek glory, or find a new home. With their ships, the Vikings weren't bound by borders. The ocean was their road, and every horizon was an invitation. The world first truly noticed the Vikings on a quiet summer day in the year 793. It began on the holy island of Lindisfarne, just off the northeastern coast of England. For years, monks had lived there in peace, copying manuscripts, praying, tending their flocks. It was a sacred place, a place of silence, learning, and devotion. Then came the ships, long, slender, and unfamiliar. They sliced through the sea with terrifying grace, no warning, no negotiations, no chance to prepare. The Vikings came ashore swiftly. Their axes flashed, their shields clashed, and in moments the monastery, once a place of sanctuary, became a scene of chaos. The monks were unarmed. They had no soldiers, no walls, no idea what was coming. Some were killed, others taken as slaves. The church was plundered. Gold, silver, and holy relics were carried away. It was not just a robbery, it was a shock. The people of Christian Europe believed their holy sites were protected by divine power. But here were these strange men from the north, gods of thunder on their lips, not Christ. News of the raid spread quickly. It was written in fear and disbelief. The wrath of the Northmen, one chronicler wrote, is upon us. To the English, the Vikings seemed like demons, merciless, bloodthirsty, and godless. But to the Vikings, it was something else entirely. They saw wealth, unguarded and plentiful, and they took it. Lindisfarne was only the beginning. Over the next few decades, Viking raids became more frequent, not just in England, but across Ireland, Scotland, and the coasts of France. They struck monasteries, ports, and villages, always quickly, often without warning. And always they left behind fear and legend. Before anyone could react, the Vikings struck. Swift, silent, and merciless, they came not for destruction alone. But for gain silver, spices, livestock, and slaves, these raids were not senseless acts of violence. They were acts of survival and ambition. To a Viking warrior, a successful raid meant more than riches, it meant honor. It meant a name that would echo in fire-lit halls, sung in sagas, remembered by future generations. But the early raids marked more than just individual glory. They changed the world's perception of the North. The Vikings weren't just shadows on the horizon, they became a force to be reckoned with. No coast was safe. Yet, as the decades passed, something remarkable happened. The Vikings began to settle in places like Ireland. What began as raider camps evolved into bustling towns, Dublin, Wexford, and others. Viking settlements took root, and what was once a temporary base became a permanent home. These Norsemen, who had once sailed in search of wealth, began building markets, homes, and communities. In northern England, they carved out a territory known as the Danelaw land governed by Viking law. In Scotland, the Orkney and Shetland Islands became Norse strongholds. In Eastern Europe, Vikings known as the Rus navigated rivers, establishing trade hubs and ruling over Slavic communities. These outposts would eventually evolve into cities like Caillou. Perhaps the most significant shift came in France. In 911, a Viking chieftain named Rollo struck a deal with King Charles, the Simple of the Franks. After years of raiding, Rollo agreed to stop in exchange for land. That land became Normandy, the land of the Northmen. Over generations, the Vikings of Normandy adopted Christianity, learned the French language, and embraced local customs. Yet they never lost the spirit of their ancestors. Their descendants would go on to become some of the most influential figures in medieval Europe, including William the Conqueror. The same hands that once wielded axes now held plows. Viking warriors became farmers, raiders became rulers. They intermarried with local populations, blending cultures and reshaping societies. Their gods came with them or were left behind. Their ships became vessels of trade instead of war. They weren't just destroyers of kingdoms. They were founders of them. To truly understand the Vikings, we must understand what they believed. Norse mythology shaped every decision, every voyage, every battle. The Viking worldview was steeped in mysticism, fate, and divine purpose. They believed their lives were woven by the Norns' three sisters who spun the destinies of every man and woman at the base of Yggdrasil, the world tree. Nothing was random. Everything had purpose. At the center of their mythic universe stood Odin, the Allfather. He was the god of wisdom, war, and poetry. In his quest for knowledge, Odin sacrificed one of his eyes. He wandered the world in search of truth, accompanied by ravens who whispered secrets. Thor, god of thunder, was another central figure. Wielding the mighty hammer Mjolnir, he protected gods and humans from chaos. Vikings wore his hammer as a symbol of strength and protection. Then there was Freya, the goddess of love, war, and beauty. She claimed half the souls of fallen warriors, while the other half went to Odin's great hall, Valhalla. In Valhalla, the brave feasted and fought until the end of days. This belief fueled Viking courage. Death was not to be feared. It was a gateway, but only for those who died with honor. To die in battle was to live forever. To die of old age was to fade into obscurity. These myths were more than stories. They were guides for how to live fiercely, with pride and resolve. The gods were not distant figures. They were present, watching, judging. And when a Viking raised his sword, he did so with the hope of being seen, being chosen. One of the most iconic but inaccurate images of the Viking Age is that of the horned helmet. Towering warriors with horn-adorned headgear have captured the imagination of artists, filmmakers, and audiences for centuries. But this image is a myth. No archaeological evidence has ever found a Viking helmet with horns. None appear in Viking art, tapestries, or textile. So where did this idea come from? In the 19th century, during the Romantic era, artists became fascinated by ancient myths. When composer Richard Wagner staged operas about Norse gods and heroes, costume designers crafted horned helmets to match the drama. These theatrical costumes became iconic. Over time, the horned helmet became shorthand for Viking in art and media. But real Viking helmets were practical, rounded, iron-forged, and close-fitting. Horns would have been a dangerous liability in battle. This doesn't mean the Vikings lacked artistry. Their weapons, jewelry, and ships were often beautifully carved with knotwork, dragons, and sacred symbols. But their battle gear was designed for function, not flair. Despite this, the horned helmet myth persists. It appears in cartoons, football, team logos, and Halloween costumes. Yet the truth is far more compelling. The Vikings didn't need horns to inspire raiding fear and settling. Their silence, the Vikings were explorers, their among the greatest the world has ever known, and their sheer adaptability. While others feared the sea, the Norse embraced it. For them, the ocean wasn't a barrier. It was a road, driven by overpopulation, limited farmland, and curiosity. Viking explorers pushed beyond the map's edges. First, they traveled to the British Isles, then Ireland and Scotland. They discovered the Faroe Islands and soon after Iceland. In the late 9th century, Norse families began settling Iceland, founding farms, and establishing the world's oldest parliament. They also began writing sagas, epic tales of gods, ghosts, and heroism, but their journey didn't end there. In the 10th century, Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland, sailed west and found a vast icy land. He named it Greenland to attract settlers. It worked. Communities took root. But the most legendary voyage came soon after. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, sailed even farther. He landed in a land of forests, grasslands, and grapes, a place the Norse called Vinland. Scholars agree Vinland was part of modern-day Newfoundland in Canada. There, the Vikings built a small settlement, Lonsdale Meadows. It was the first known European presence in North America, nearly 500 years before Columbus. However, the Norse presence in Vinland was brief. Conflict with indigenous peoples, brutal winters, and the sheer distance from home proved too great. Still, the journey was monumental. The Vikings had crossed the Atlantic. They had mapped new worlds. They proved that medieval seafarers could reach across oceans and return in the end. The Vikings were not just raiders, not just settlers, not just explorers. They were all of these and more. They changed Europe's political landscape. They shaped languages, cultures, and economies. Their myths still echo. Their ships remain symbols of innovation. And their legacy is woven into the very fabric of the Western world. Their story reminds us of something timeless, that human beings, whether from fjords or forests, kingdoms or villages, are driven by the same forces: hope, survival, curiosity, ambition, and the desire to leave a mark on the world. The Vikings did more than leave a mark. They carved one deep into history, one wave, one saga, one ship at a time. By the early 11th century, the Viking era was drawing to a close. The fearless Norse explorers had roamed vast distances, reshaped empires, and altered the course of history. But the tides of time were changing. The world they had once dominated through raids and conquest was evolving, and with it, so too did the role of the Vikings themselves. Though their infamous raids had once sent shockwaves through Europe, by the mid-1000s, they were waning. The reasons were many: stronger coastal defenses, fortified towns, and rising kingdoms that no longer cowered at the sight of dragon-headed ships. More than anything, however, it was the Vikings themselves who changed. The ships still sailed. but carried merchants rather than marauders. Viking swords were sheathed more often in trade negotiations than in battle. The fierce independence of the Norse world was giving way to governance, law, and religion. Christianity had been spreading gradually through the Norse territories, brought by missionaries and priests, sometimes as prisoners, sometimes welcomed as advisors. Over time, their influence grew. Norse kings and chieftains began converting to Christianity, seeing it as a way to forge alliances with Christian neighbors and to legitimize their rule. With conversion came change. Pagan temples were replaced by churches, and oral traditions began to be recorded in written form. In Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, centralized monarchies began to emerge. Local chieftains who had once ruled through personal power and clan loyalty were now answering to royal authority and national law. Taxes began to replace tribute, and administration replaced raiding. Viking society was becoming organized and state-like, preparing for the centuries to come. One of the final acts of the Viking Age played out in England. In 1066, King Harald Hardrada of Norway attempted to claim the English throne. He arrived with a formidable force and won an initial victory at Fulford. However, just days later, he was defeated and killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. It was a decisive moment. Yet, even as one Viking dream ended, another legacy continued. Just weeks later, William, Duke of Normandy himself, a descendant of Viking settlers in France, crossed the English Channel and won the Battle of Hastings. He became William the Conqueror, King of England, and the Viking story came full circle, from raiders to rulers. Though the Viking Age had ended, their legacy endured in countless ways. In England, thousands of towns and villages still bear names of Norse origin. Everyday words like sky, window, knife, and berserk come from Old Norse. Even our days of the week are named in honor of Norse gods. Tuesday for Tyr, Wednesday for Odin, Thursday for Thor, and Friday for Freya. In Ireland, cities like Dublin began as Viking camps and grew into major trade hubs. In France, the Normans would go on to become one of the most powerful forces in European history. In Iceland, the old language still survives, almost unchanged from Viking times, allowing modern Icelanders to read ancient sagas in their original form, those sagas filled with tales of gods. Monsters and human drama form a cultural treasure trove. They reveal the values and beliefs of a people who dared to challenge the sea, who sought honor in battle, and who believed in a world shaped by fate and the will of the gods. They speak of Odin, the one-eyed god of wisdom and war, of Thor, protector of mankind, of Freya, goddess of beauty and battle, and of Valhalla, the hall of the slain, where brave warriors would feast and fight until the end of days. Even today, the image of the Viking endures in pop culture. Books, films, and television shows reimagine them as fierce, free-spirited warriors. While myths like the idea that Vikings wore horned helmets persist, the fascination with Viking culture reflects something deeper, a longing for the boldness, curiosity, and resilience that define their age. Their ships now rest in museums. Their weapons lie buried in the earth. But the Viking spirit, relentless, brave, and endlessly curious, still moves beneath the surface of our modern world. The sea, once a barrier, became their pathway. And in embracing the unknown, the Vikings helped shape a new Europe, one that remembered them not only as invaders, but as builders, traders, and pioneers. Long before European powers set sail across the Atlantic, another powerful civilization thrived far from the Norse world. Deep in the Valley of Mexico, rising from the blue waters of Lake Texcoco, stood Tenochtitlan, the magnificent capital of the Aztec Empire. Founded in 1325 on a swampy lake bed, it was a city of canals, pyramids, and vibrant marketplaces. Legend. said the Aztecs had been guided by a prophecy. They would find an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent. When that sign appeared on an island in the lake, they began to build, and build they did. By the early 1500s, Tenochtitlan was one of the largest and most sophisticated cities in the world. With over 200,000 residents, broad causeways connected the island city to the mainland. Aqueducts brought fresh water and canals crisscrossed. The city bustling with canoes. At its center stood the Templo Mayor, a grand pyramid with twin shrines, one for Huitzilopochtli, god of war and sun, and the other for Tlaloc, god of rain and fertility. Aztec society was highly structured. Nobles, priests, warriors, merchants, and farmers each played distinct roles. Children learned to read pictographs and memorize oral histories. Trade flourished. Goods like cacao, feathers, obsidian, and jade flowed into the capital. Religion permeated daily life. Ceremonies, dances, and offerings were performed regularly. Human sacrifice, horrifying to European eyes, was seen by the Aztecs as a sacred duty to maintain cosmic balance. At the apex of this empire stood Moctezuma II. Revered as a divine figure, he ruled through complex rituals and a network of advisors. He was deeply spiritual, cautious, and conscious of omens. Yet under his rule, cracks in the empire were beginning to show. Many neighboring peoples resented Aztec domination. They had endured years of tribute, conscription, and sacrifice. Beneath, the splendor of Tenochtitlan simmered unrest. Across the Atlantic, the Spanish Empire was expanding. In 1519, Hernan Cortes landed on the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula with just over 500 soldiers, a handful of horses, and a burning ambition to claim riches and glory. He had no official permission to conquer an empire, but he had boldness and cunning. As the Spaniards marched inland, they encountered resistance, but also opportunity. Many indigenous groups, long oppressed by the Aztecs, saw the Spanish as potential liberators. Cortes' most valuable ally was Melanson, also known as La Noche, a native woman fluent in multiple languages. She became his interpreter, advisor, and later his partner. Through her, Cortes could communicate, negotiate, and manipulate. Her insight into local politics and culture proved invaluable. Step by step, alliance by alliance, he advanced toward the heart of the Aztec world. News of the Spaniards reached Moctezuma. The emperor was filled with dread. Strange omens, a comet, fires, and the appearance of white-skinned strangers haunted him. Unsure whether Cortes was a god or a man, he chose diplomacy. Gifts were sent, dialogues began. Eventually, Cortes and his small force entered Tenochtitlan. What they found astonished them, a city more magnificent than any they had seen in. Europe thought at first the Spanish were welcomed. But tension simmered. Cortes took Moctezuma hostage, trying to rule through him. The situation grew volatile. Rebellions flared. In 1520, after a violent uprising, the Spanish fled the city in a chaotic retreat known as La Noche Triste, or the Night of Sorrows, but Cortes regrouped. With the help of thousands of indigenous allies, he laid siege to Tenochtitlan. For months, the city suffered starvation, disease, and relentless attack. In August 1521, Tenochtitlan fell. Its temples were torn down. Its treasures seized. The Aztec Empire had collapsed, yet the legacy of Tenochtitlan and its people remains. Today, Mexico City stands where the great city once rose. The eagle, cactus, and serpent of the founding prophecy now appear on the national flag of Mexico. The language of the Aztecs, Nahuatl, still echoes in everyday words. Their cultural and spiritual heritage lives on in art, in tradition, and in memory. Like the Vikings, the Aztecs shaped the world they touched. Both were builders, warriors, and believers in a greater destiny. Both faced dramatic ends at the hands of forces they could not have foreseen. Yet their stories endure reminders of the power of ambition, the cost of conquest, and the richness of human civilization. Who died? By dawn, hundreds of Spaniards and thousands of their allies were dead. The survivors staggered to the shore, bloodied, broken, and silent. This night would be remembered as La Noche Triste, the night of sorrows. Hernan Cortes wept beneath a tree as he counted his losses, not just in gold and men, but in the illusion of control. The Aztec capital had become a graveyard of Spanish ambition, but the story was not over. Court Yacutes did not give up. In the months that followed, he regrouped. He moved to Tlaxcala, a bitter enemy of the Aztecs, and there he rebuilt his army. Spanish. Reinforcements arrived from Cuba. Indigenous allies gathered by the thousands, drawn by hatred for the empire that had once demanded their sons and daughters as tribute. Cortes began a campaign of siege and destruction, tearing through the surrounding cities, cutting supply lines, poisoning wells, and laying waste to every town loyal to Tenochtitlan. It was not just a war of conquest, it became a war of starvation. In the spring of 1521, Cortes returned to the Valley of Mexico, not as a guest, but as an invader. He laid siege to Tenochtitlan for months. The once mighty city, surrounded by lake water and causeways, had become a prison for its own people. Disease had begun to spread. Smallpox, brought by the Europeans, burned through the population like wildfire. It spared no one, from nobles to warriors to children. Tens of thousands died before the Spaniards fired a single shot. As food ran out and the canals turned foul, the defenders fought with everything they had. They were led now by Cuauhtémoc, the young and brave successor to Montezuma. Cuauhtémoc refused to surrender. He fought from rooftops and alleyways. His warriors built barricades, filled canals with traps, and battled tooth and nail, even as the city crumbled around them, but they could not hold forever. By August 13th, 1521, after 93 days of siege, the city finally fell. Cuauhtémoc was captured as he tried to flee across the lake. When brought before Cortes, he asked the conquistador to end his life swiftly, saying, "I have done what was my duty in defense of my city and my people. Now do what you will." But Cortes spared him for a time. Tenochtitlan was gone, burned, razed, its temples leveled, its people either killed, enslaved, or scattered. The waters of Lake Texcoco ran dark. A city once described as the Venice of the New World, with its grand pyramids and vibrant markets, had become little more than ruins and ash, but the Spanish did not leave the ruins to time. On its bones, they built a new city, Mexico City, the capital of New Spain, the heart of Spanish colonial power in the Americas. Stones from the Temple Mayor were used to build cathedrals. Canals were filled. Churches rose where temples once stood. The gods of the old world were silenced, at least outwardly, as Christianity took hold. Yet even in defeat, the Aztec world did not disappear. Its bloodline survived in the people. Its language, Nahuatl, continued to be spoken. Its foods, its farming practices, its art, and its memory endured. The great codices, though many were burned, passed on fragments of a proud civilization. The myths, the sunstones, the names of gods, they lived on in whispered stories, in songs and resistance. Cortes would be hailed as a hero in Spain, though his reputation grew more complicated in time. He became governor, then fell out of favor. He died in relative obscurity, never fully able to control the lands he had conquered, but what he set in motion, the fall of the Aztec Empire, would change the world. Gold and silver flowed from the Americas to Europe, funding empires, wars, and revolutions. Entire continents were reshaped. cultures erased, blended, or forced underground. The conquest of the Aztecs was not just the end of one civilization, it was the beginning of a global era of colonization and resistance that would echo for centuries. Today, Tenochtitlan sleeps beneath the modern streets of Mexico City. Yet, if you walk its plazas, you can still see remnants, stones of the old temples, symbols of the sun and moon carved into walls, echoes of drums and prayers hidden in the heartbeat of a city that never truly died. And above all, you'll find people descendants of the Mexica, proud of their heritage, speaking the words and names passed down through fire and silence. History does not forget cities like Tenochtitlan. It buries them, reshapes them, renames them, but beneath every layer of stone and story, something remains. A memory, a lesson, a truth. The fall of the Aztec Empire was not the end of a people. It was a transformation, a forced collision between worlds. And though one empire fell, the spirit of its civilization still beats, not in monuments or empires, but in culture, language, and the unbroken will of those who remember in the early hours of June 30th, 1520. The causeways of Tenochtitlan were soaked in blood and rain. The Spanish forces, led by Hernán were fleeing the city under cover of night. Gold clinked in their packs, looted from the great temples of the Aztec capital. Around them, chaos raged. Canoes filled with Aztec warriors sliced through the waters of Lake Texcoco. Arrows flew like angry insects, and the cries of the dying echoed through the mist. Thousands of Tlaxcalan allies had already fallen. Hundreds of Spaniards drowned in the canals, weighed down by greed. Horses thrashed in panic before vanishing beneath the water's surface. And somewhere under the darkened sky, Cortes himself wept beneath a tree. This night would be remembered in Spanish memory as La Noche Triste, the night of sorrows. They had entered Tenochtitlan as guests, they left it as ghosts, but the Spaniards were not finished. Though shattered and humiliated, they retreated to the nearby city of Tlaxcala, longtime enemies of the Aztecs, where they licked their wounds and planned their revenge. Reinforcements arrived from Cuba. More indigenous allies, seeking freedom from Aztec domination, rallied to Cortes. His army, once a few hundred conquistadors, now numbered in the tens of thousands. Yet even as he rebuilt, another force was already ravaging the empire from within. Smallpox, carried by a single infected African slave in Spanish ranks, had arrived in Tenochtitlan. No one noticed it at first, a fever, a cough, a rash. But within weeks, entire neighborhoods were afflicted. The disease tore through the population like wildfire, swift, merciless, and unfamiliar. The Aztecs had never encountered a sickness like it. Their immune systems had no defense. Their healers were helpless. As families died within their homes, the city's priests turned to the gods. Offerings were made. Prayers were chanted, but nothing stopped the plague. The city's marketplaces grew quiet. The great temples, once alive with music and incense, echoed with silence. Even the emperor, Cuauhtémoc Montezuma's brother and successor, succumbed to the disease after only 80 days on the throne. In the midst of this devastation, a new leader rose. Cuauhtémoc, a young noble known for his courage, wisdom, and resolve. Though Tenochtitlan was ravaged by disease and weakened by war, Cuauhtémoc was determined to defend it to the last breath. He knew that surrender would not mean peace, it would mean the end of their world. In the spring of 1521, Cortes returned to the Valley of Mexico. This time, he did not come as a diplomat or guest. He came as an invader. He began a brutal campaign to isolate the capital, burning surrounding cities, cutting off supply lines, poisoning wells, and destroying farmland. His forces built brigantines, small, Warships assembled from parts carried across mountains to control Lake Texcoco. With the waters and causeways under his command, he laid siege to Tenochtitlan. The city's defenses were formidable and its people proud. Even as smallpox and starvation tore through the population, they refused to abandon hope. Aztec warriors fought from rooftops and canals. They dug traps in the streets, built barricades, and ambushed Spanish soldiers with obsidian blades and slings. Women and children joined the effort, carrying food, water, and arrows to the front lines. Though outgunned and outnumbered, they fought with unmatched determination. But it wasn't enough. Over the course of 93 grueling days, Cortes and his allies pressed deeper into the city. Block by block, temple by temple, the once great capital was reduced to rubble. Canals were choked with corpses. The water turned black with blood and waste. The smell of rot filled the air. Even the famed Chinampas floating gardens that had fed the city for centuries withered and died. By August, the city was unrecognizable. The great temples had been leveled. The streets were ruins. The people were starving, sick, and broken. Still, Cuauhtémoc refused to surrender. With what little strength remained, he tried to flee by canoe across the lake. But he was captured by Spanish forces. Brought before Cortes, he spoke with the dignity of a fallen king. "I have done what was my duty in defense of my people," he said. "Now I am your prisoner. Take this dagger and kill me." But Cortes spared him for a time. He would later be tortured, suspected of hiding treasure, and eventually executed. The conquerors had no place for symbols of resistance. On August 13th, 1521, the city of Tenochtitlan fell. The Spanish victory was complete, but it came at a terrible cost. What they conquered was not a functioning empire, but a graveyard. The most magnificent city in the Americas, described by conquistadors as more beautiful than anything in Europe, was reduced to ash and bone. More than 200,000 people had lived there. By the end of the siege, only a fraction survived. Cortes immediately began transforming the ruins into the capital of a new empire, Mexico City, the heart of New Spain. Stones from the destroyed temples were used to build cathedrals. Christian churches rose where Aztec gods had once been worshipped. The surviving Aztecs were enslaved or forced into labor. Spanish rule was established not just through violence, but through culture, language, law, and religion. Yet even as the city was rebuilt in European style, the memory of what had come before could not be erased. Beneath the colonial buildings, the foundations of the old temples remained. Indigenous customs, though outlawed, survived in secret. Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, continued to be spoken. Songs, stories, and ceremonies were whispered from generation to generation. Cortes returned to Spain years later, hailed as a hero, though his later life was marked by political struggles and declining influence. He never ruled New Spain as he had hoped. The crown, eager to limit the power of its conquistadors, replaced him with bureaucrats. He died in 1547, wealthy but bitter. His legacy forever tied to both glory and genocide. The fall of Tenochtitlan was more than the collapse of a city. It marked the violent meeting of two worlds. Gold and silver flowed from the Americas into Europe, fueling the rise of empires and global trade. The Spanish colonization of the Americas continued, expanding north, south, and west. But the consequences were staggering. Millions of indigenous people died from disease, war, and slavery. Entire cultures were disrupted, languages lost, and histories rewritten. And yet, the Aztec world did not vanish. It was wounded, buried, transformed, but not destroyed. Today, the descendants of the Mexicas still live in Mexico. Nahuatl is spoken by more than 1 million people. Ancient foods like maize, chili, and cacao remain staples of Mexican cuisine. Aztec symbols appear in art, clothing, and even the national flag, which features the eagle and serpent once prophesied by their ancestors. In Mexico City, you can visit the Templo Mayor, excavated beneath colonial buildings, where archaeologists have uncovered temples, altars, and offerings to the old gods. Tourists walk the same streets where warriors once marched. School children learn about Cuauhtémoc and the bravery of the defenders of Tenochtitlan. Murals by artists like Diego Rivera tell the story of conquest, not from the view of the conqueror, but through the eyes of the conquered. The conquest of Tenochtitlan was swift and brutal, but memory is stubborn. Though stone was shattered, the spirit endured. The Aztec calendar, once outlawed, is now celebrated. Traditional ceremonies are performed openly, and every year on August 13th, some remember the fall not as a defeat, but as a beginning of resistance, survival, and cultural rebirth. History does not forget cities like Tenochtitlan. Time may bury them, conquerors may rename them, but beneath every plaza, beneath every church, the roots of the past still twist and pulse. And when we listen, truly listen, we can hear the drums, the prayers, and the heartbeat of a civilization that refused to be erased. A chronicle of survival, humanity, and horror warning could turn to chaos in seconds. The air reeked of decay, unwashed bodies and wet earth. Rats thrived in this world, growing fat on the corpses of fallen soldiers. Lice burrowed deep into clothing and skin, causing relentless itching and spreading disease from man to man. Sleep came in short, restless bursts. Food, when it arrived, was cold and tasteless. A single letter from home became a treasured possession. And yet, somehow, the men adapted. They dug deeper into the mud, reinforcing their shelters with sandbags, scrap metal, and wood scavenged from broken crates. In these hellish conditions, they built a semblance of home makeshift furniture, shared cigarettes, whispered jokes. They wrote letters, they waited, and they endured. In the trenches, survival wasn't merely physical, it was psychological. It meant holding on to something: identity, humor, fragments of hope. Because even as the world crumbled around them, it wasn't the front lines that broke most men. It was the slow, grinding weight of life behind the wire, the endless days and nights where nothing happened and everything hurt. In that grim silence, where boots never dried and death came without warning, one thing brought warmth more powerful than fire: letters. Mail call was sacred. A scrap of paper from a wife, a sweetheart, a mother, a child. These meant more than rations or sleep. They reminded soldiers that life beyond the mud still existed, that someone saw them not as soldiers, but as sons, husbands, fathers, soldiers. Wrote back by candlelight, hunched in dugouts filled with the scent of damp earth, oil, and tobacco. Their words were plain, sometimes poetic, often aching. They wrote of the weather, of their meals, of moments of quiet, omitting the blood and fear. They wanted to shield their loved ones, even as shells exploded overhead. Some wrote daily, others less often. They addressed their wives as "my dearest," their mothers as "dear mum," and their children with a love that could not be contained. I hope you are well. I am still in one piece. I miss your voice. Tell the baby I love her. They enclosed pressed flowers, hand-drawn sketches, or tiny charms found in ruined villages. Receiving a letter was a ritual, read once, then again, and pocket again. Close to the heart, it would be folded in a tin box to guard it from the rain. Sometimes they would read them aloud to friends, passing them around so everyone could share in the joy or sorrow. But not all letters arrived in time. Mail could take weeks, and sometimes it came for the dead. In such cases, comrades gathered, opened it gently, and read it aloud, one last connection to a life cut short. In a war of mud and machines, where death was a statistic, letters brought humanity. They bridge two worlds, peace and war, love and loss. And in the darkest places, a single page could save a man's soul. It was Christmas Eve, 1914, the first winter of a war that was supposed to end by now. The trenches were coated in frost, frozen to the bone. Men huddled together, dreaming of warmth, of home, of peace. Then, across the barren land between trenches, came a sound no one expected. Singing. Still not, heilig not. German voices rose into the night air. British troops froze, but answered with their own carols. What followed became one of the most remarkable moments of the war. Without orders or planning, soldiers from both sides began to climb from their trenches. They met in no man's land where barbed wire, corpses, and craters ruled and shook hands. Some shared buttons, chocolate, tobacco. Others exchanged sausages for plum pudding. And then from somewhere, a football appeared. A game began. There were no rules, no score, just boots and laughter in the snow. Men showed each other photographs of families, lit candles, and buried their dead. For one brief night, there was no war, only men, cold and tired, aching not to kill, but to live. It didn't last. The generals were furious. Orders came down. No more fraternization. Artillery resumed. Machine guns returned. And the soldiers who had just embraced went back to killing one another. The truce was never repeated at such scale. But for those who were there, it became a sacred memory. A sliver of humanity in a war meant to erase it. Proof that peace didn't need a treaty, just courage, cold hands, and open hearts. The noise of war is unforgettable. The screech of shells, the rattle of machine guns, the sudden, final snap of a sniper's bullet. But what many soldiers remembered most was the silence. The long, heavy stretches between battles when nothing moved but the wind. In those hours, fear did its worst work. Men sat with their thoughts. Some wrote, some smoked in silence. Others just stared at the damp wooden walls of the trench, waiting, not knowing if the next moment would bring a charge, a raid, a death. The silence wasn't peace. It was thick and cruel. Every whisper, every creak, every cough might betray them. At night, the tension doubled. Flares rose above the wire like ghostly spirits, shadows twisted in the flickering light. Was this the night they would come? Some nights they did. The silence would shatter with gunfire, a single scream, then fade back into stillness more dreadful than before. In those pauses, soldiers buried the dead, patched the trenches, and boiled tea in dirty tins. They played cards, told stories, and counted time in letters and rations. Silence was not rest, it was reflection. And in reflection, fear took root. They listened, their heartbeats like they were counting down to the end, and yet they stayed. Not for glory, not always for duty, sometimes because there was nowhere else to go. In trench life, survival wasn't just in the battles. It was. In the waiting. Then came the gas. The first gas attack rolled in like a strange green mist. It moved low, clinging to the earth like a creeping curse. It was April 1915, near Ypres, Belgium. The Germans had unleashed chlorine gas. At first, soldiers just stared at it, this odd fog, curious, unafraid. But then came the burning, the choking, the panic. Chlorine turned lungs to liquid, seared eyes, and made strong men collapse like children. Some tried urinating on rags and pressing them to their faces, anything to survive. Then came phosgene, deadlier, less detectable. And mustard gas, slow, agonizing, lingering in the soil for weeks. It blistered skin, blinded eyes, scarred lungs. It didn't always kill. Often it left men breathing, but broken. Changed forever. Gas masks followed rubber contraptions with goggled eyes and snouts. Useful, but not foolproof. Putting them on in a panic, in the dark, With trembling hands, it didn't always happen in time. Even when gas wasn't present, fear lingered. A strange smell, a shifting breeze, a sudden tightness in the throat, and the mask came on. Many said the gas was like a ghost haunting their dreams, invisible, inescapable. It changed the war, changed the men, left wounds no doctor could treat.